Chapter 38. Row. The water roared. There was noise, crushing weight, and then the noise of the water faded. Row was on the ground, smeared in earth, gasping for air. The ground had sunk around him, as if the riverbed had swallowed it back into itself, turned it into silt. He got his hands under himself, dragged himself back to his feet, wild energy roaring through him. He saw the bridge. He stared at it, eyes wide, wondering if he'd finally gone mad. Then Simma's hand was on his arm, Simma's voice, as if through a thick fog, demanding he move. "She's done her part," Simma was yelling. Her eyes were wet. "Now do yours." That snapped him back into his skin. He yelled for Narayan, called to his men to run, to ride, and the cry was taken up as they surged as one toward the strange bridge that covered the expanse of the water. Rao swung into an empty chariot and took to the reins. "Simma," he said, "get up here. I'll be your charioteer. You shoot." She stared at him, wiped an arm over her eyes, and clambered up. The chariot jerked, and then the horse was guiding them swiftly over the bridge, over the water. And Simma was raising her bow and knocking an arrow, and they were crashing into the flank of the Parijatipan army in a wave of motion. Chandra's forces were crushed between Rao's half of the army and Malini's. Behind them stood Aloran and Sakitan soldiers, garbed in their turbans and liege marks. Before them were Parijati, gleaming in their white armor, Shungani and Dwarwali cavalry. They had nowhere to turn. There was no clear ending to it, only a moment when he was guiding the horse as Simma grimly shot a man through the chest, and then, as if darkness had descended and lifted abruptly in his mind, he found himself stumbling from the chariot. There were bodies everywhere, men's screams and groans as they died, and carrion birds already wheeling hopefully overhead. But it was over. It had ended, and nameless bless them, they had not lost. They had not lost. Prince Ashutosh had survived, to Rao's surprise. Ashutosh's men were huddled around him, watching as he was attended to by one of the camp physicians. He was grey-faced, lips mottled with cold, but when he saw Rao, he gave a jerky bow of his head. Rao returned it, a strange shadow of relief blooming in his chest. He did not like Ashutosh exactly, but he had been sure the man would die the moment the arrows fell on the river. His survival was a small miracle. Priya's miracle, Rao reminded himself. He couldn't entirely let himself recall the sight of her in the churning water, glassy waves rising up around her, unearthed roots spiraling above her. It made him feel as if he'd been unmoored from his skin. He breathed around the panic of it, the sense of wrongness and elation, all entangled together and impossible for him to unknot, and turned toward the ford. He remembered the vision of the Nameless that Aditya had showed him long ago in the lacquer gardens. The way it had filled his skull with strangeness and terror. This was possibly worse. He felt small and helpless in the face of it, painfully conscious of his mortal body and mortal bones. He forced himself to concentrate on what was around him, the mud beneath his feet, the corpses strewn around him, Simma ahead of him. Simma was striding onward without pause. It was only when she started wading into the water that he realized anything was amiss. There was a soldier yelling at her from the bank, trying to call her back. She was submerged to the chest. Rao could only see the shape of her shoulders, the snaking line of her braid as she waded forward through the corpses. Rao stepped to the water's edge and cupped a hand to his mouth to make his voice carry. "You don't want to be out there," Rao called. "Please come back to the shore." Simma turned her head. "No," she said, her teeth chattering. "You come in here." "Lady Simma, I told you I'm not a lady." Her voice was wild. "My lord, Prince Rao, I can't. Don't you see?" A tumble of words pouring out of her. "Priya never came back. Priya is somewhere out here, and I need to find her." "Simma, help me or don't," she said, and turned again, wading determinedly deeper. Rao stripped down to his tunic and trousers, oil padding and armor thrown to the ground. Then he jumped into the water after her. It was cold, fetid. He bit his tongue and waded deeper, following the figure of Simma ahead of him. He caught up with her fast, splashed the water beside her with his hand in a gesture that felt childish, but also better than attempting to touch her when she was trembling with barely leashed panic. "Go back to solid ground," he entreated. "Simma, I'll find her. I promise you." Seeing doubt in her eyes, he added, "If I don't, the Empress will skin me. I'm not risking that." "I'm a strong swimmer," she said. I'll find her," he told her. "Please." For a moment it looked as if Simma would argue. Then, still shaking, she nodded. "Thank you," Rao said to her. He waited until she'd made her way back to the bank, then swam deeper. Above him the bridge of roots arched, vast and intricately knotted, light breaking through the small perforations in bright diamonds between the shadows it threw on the water below. He called out Priya's name and heard his own voice fade into smallness, swallowed by the lapping of the water against bodies, against the struts of the great bridge. "Prince Rao!" A yell from behind him. "My lord, wait!" He turned and saw one of Ashutosh's men following him. The man was clearly wounded, his shoulder bandaged, blood bleeding faintly through the cloth. "Get out of the water," Rao called back. "You'll get your wound infected." "I spoke to the Ahirani girl," he said, gesturing at Simma, who was standing at the bank, with oilcloth wrapped tightly around her. "I know where the other one is, or was." "Show me," Rao demanded. He led Rao to where the islet had been. Now there was nothing. The soldier pointed a hand to where exactly he'd last seen Priya, wincing as he pulled his shoulder and said, "She protected us here, with that unnatural magic of hers." The man's mouth curled into a sneer, but it seemed more like a reflex than a true expression of disgust. Then the look faded, and he hesitated momentarily before wetting his lips and carrying on. "I saw her collapse into the water, right there, and I didn't see her come back up. Whatever she was, my lord, she deserves a decent funeral." "You think she's dead?" Rao said, strangely numb. "Of course, my lord. How could she not be?" How indeed? Any right-thinking man would know what no mortal could survive after collapsing into water. No human could survive airless, weighted down by a river. Why had Rao not considered that? Not even ruminated over the possibility of Priya's death? Perhaps the hope that burned in him despite all logic was the result of a mind overfevered by battle. But Rao did not think so. Sometimes a belief or instinct was a gift from the nameless, and this felt true. Priya was not dead, not yet. "What's your name?" Rao asked the soldier. "Romesh, my lord." "Wait here for me, Romesh." Rao gestured at the islet, then began to swim in the direction Romesh had pointed. Through the water he could see fronds of things that should not have been growing there. Feathery leaves, so green they were almost lit from the inside. Flowers that rose rust-hued of blood, and then fading white of teeth. Rot, he thought at first, and then Priya. She lay beneath him in the water, face visible, hair loose around her, eyes closed. He reached for her immediately, hands closing over nothing as if she were a mirage, an illusion of light, a trickery of the water. He didn't allow himself to think, only sucked a deep breath and dived down, the light shining through the water onto the both of them. He reached for her. Her eyes snapped open, black, fathomless in the dark, 2 points, swallowing all the light around him. She reached back. For a moment he was entirely unmoored from his body, panicked, unable to move, and then he was weightless. He felt as if he could breathe, or as if he did not need to breathe, as if his lungs were not struggling for air, as if he were more or less than flesh. Worlds were revolving around them, great stars imploding and darkening into nothing as they hung suspended in darkness that rippled and lived. He felt as if a priest of the nameless had guided him into a vision and left him there, abandoned him to the maelstrom of the nameless's voice. A coming, an inevitable coming. Priya's eyes were not her own. She was holding him by the hand, mouthing words he couldn't read or hear, great peals of song breaking like waves against his ears. He struggled against her, trying to pull away, and then remembered himself, and reached for her instead. He was taking her back. He had made a promise, and if he did not, If he did not, what would Melini do if he did not? Priya, he mouthed in return, searching for his voice clawed it from his throat. Priya, whatever this is, please stop this. She blinked, shuddered out a breath, and then abruptly, it was over. Lungs heaving, body screaming for air, Priya a dead weight in his arms, he moved her into the hold of one arm and kicked his feet against the silt, propelling them both upward. Dragged her up, out of the water, and heaved a ragged breath. He turned her face to the side, trying to feel for the flutter of her breath one-handed. He wrenched open her jaw, trying to clear her mouth of water with clumsy fingers, and there it was, the faintest rush of air from her mouth. It was only then that he saw the flowers. They tumbled from her lips, small, half-opened buds, viciously golden. There were petals threaded through her hair. Then, when she blinked, he saw fine spiderwebs of green beneath her eyelids. He flinched, almost let her go. Thank the nameless he managed to resist the impulse. He couldn't let anyone see her like this. He needed to get her to Melini. Romesh, my lord, Romesh yelled back from the island. You have her! You have her! She isn't dead, Rao replied, but she isn't decent. I need Sima, the other Ahiranyi woman. Get her a boat if you can, and get her to come and meet me out here. No one else. Tell her to bring an oilcloth with her. I can help. No, Rao said roughly, and then with care. You're wounded. Your prince won't thank me if you sicken. Besides, I have a care for Elder Priya's honor. You understand? Ramesh headed to the bank with no further complaint. Rao held Priya and waited. Waited and did not think of Prem's death. Did not think of the wood's whirls on his skin, or the laughter, or the way the grief that had carved Rao's chest open and left it unfilled. Stay with me, Priya, he said, somewhat ineffectually, as she breathed and bled flowers, her hair swirling in the water. What would your people do without you? He didn't know how long he held her there, feeling the contraction of her ribs as she breathed before a small makeshift boat made its way across the water, Sima clumsily directing it. Rao braced his feet against the riverbed, hefted Priya up, bending over her. What would Melini do without you? He whispered and straightened. Cover her up, he said roughly to Sima as she reached out for Priya. Her eyes widened at the sight of her friend, but she said nothing, only firmed her jaw and helped Rao get Priya onto the boat. She wiped the flowers carefully away, placed the oilcloth carefully over Priya's body as Priya's eyes fluttered again. Hush, Sima said firmly. No sound out of you, Pri. That's an order. We're getting you back to land. Priya's mouth moved, soundless, then her eyes closed again. Rao stayed in the water, directing the raft with his body. Sima held Priya steady. Will you tell anyone? Sima asked abruptly. My lord, will you? Elder Priya is an important ally to Empress Melini, he said slowly, and the Empress wouldn't want anyone to know. For a long moment there was nothing but the slap of water against the sides of the boat as he heaved it forward. Then, in a low voice, Sima said, Thank you. He kept his eyes on the bank, almost there. There's no thanks needed, he said to her. When they landed, he didn't wait for any of the soldiers to come and assist him. He lifted Priya up himself. I need a horse, he barked out. One of his men came forward with a saddled mare. With the soldiers' help and Sima's, he mounted and held Priya in front of him. Difficult as balancing her weight was, he'd be able to carry her. Sima, I'll make my own way. She was trembling again, the bravery leaving her cold as it ebbed out of her. But he trusted the look on her face, the sheer stubborn determination in it. Go, my lord. He went. Melini was no longer on the corpse-strewn battlefield, but safely in the camp. Much to Rao's relief, she was not in her tent but outside it, surrounded by her guard. Lord Prakash was kneeling before her, bowing his head. When he raised it, speaking words Rao couldn't hear, there was a look of sheer emotion on his face, pure marveling wonder. Above her, on the tent itself, her flags were raised, the imperial parijat on white and gold, painfully bright in the glare of the sun. He forced the horse to stop, thought of shouting out for Melini, then thought better of it. Calling undue attention seemed unwise. But Malini had already seen them. She turned her head, her eyes widened, and then her face stilled, falling into a mask of calm as she made her swift way toward Rao. There was soil and blood all over the hem of her sari. Dusty wind had whipped her hair askew, even in its braid, faint curls haloing her face. "Priya," she said. It was not a question, but there was something in her voice Rao had never heard, a sheer cliff edge of feeling, and Rao hurriedly to reply. "She's alive, Empress." "Summon a physician," Malini said evenly to the guard who had followed after her. "No need," Rao said, meeting Malini's eyes and hoping she would read the warning in them. "She needs rest, Empress, no more than that." Malini gestured to the guard and he went still. "Bring her into my tent, Prince Rao," said Malini. She turned. "Lord Prakash, I will speak to you later. My apologies." Lord Prakash bowed his head as if he thought anything of what he'd seen. Rao could not tell, and had no time to analyze his expression. All he cared about was sliding from his horse, lifting up Priya's weight, and carrying her to the tent. One of Malini's guards opened the way. She told them to wait outside. Inside, Lata was speaking to Swati, directing her to help gather more supplies for the sick room. When Lata saw them, she clapped a hand abruptly over Swati's eyes. Swati squeaked in alarm. "Don't worry, Swati," she said. Her gaze flicked from Rao to Priya, then to Malini. "Empress?" "Water," Malini said, crossing the room, smoothing down the blanket on her cot. "Bring food, too. Swati, you won't be needed. Only you, Lata." Without checking to see if she'd be obeyed, she went on. "Rao, lay her here." He laid her down, all the river-soaked weight of her, as Lata ushered Swati swiftly out. "You wrapped her like a corpse," said Malini. She crossed her arms, but not before Rao saw the way her fingers were trembling. "She's covered in flowers," Rao said roughly, only stumbling a little over the sheer absurdity of it. The river, crashing over a men, roots forcing themselves from silt, building a bridge. A vision. Priya bleeding flowers. I had to hide it. Muddy water stained the divan as he removed the oilcloth, drawing it back. Malini's hands hovered, not touching, as she drank in the sight of the Ahirani woman. The dust of green at her eyes, the petals still bruising her mouth, the snarl of them in her wet hair. "Thank you, Rao," she said. "I am sure you have a great deal to attend to." He knew a dismissal when he heard one. "Take care, Malini," he said softly. A caution. She said nothing. The last thing he saw before he closed the tent flap behind him was Malini touching Priya's cheek, 4 fingertips tenderly pressing into the softness of it, her eyes fierce and fathomless.